Hi, I'm Maggie Shoddy, and this is my Module 12 case study on copyright and the computer. Section 1. Let me tell you the who, what, and where of the case. This takes place at St. Regis School. It's a small, rural, kindergarten through 8th grade school. We have Mr. Sample, our principal. We have Mrs. Lynn, the library media specialist and computer lab teacher. And we have Mrs. Brandon, a 3rd grade teacher. Recently, the PTA purchased some new computer software programs to use on the computers in the computer lab. The teachers were very fond of these programs and decided they wanted to use them on their classroom computers. Mrs. Lynn loved this idea and felt the PTA would really appreciate her stretching every dollar. When she was distributing these copied materials, most of the teachers were ecstatic to receive them, but Mrs. Brandon was uncomfortable. She felt very concerned that Mrs. Lynn was violating some copyright laws. She told Mrs. Lynn about that, and Mrs. Lynn told her not to worry, that everything would be fine. Mrs. Brandon was still uncomfortable, so she approached Mr. Sample at the end of the day. Mr. Sample had no idea that this was going on, so he was very appreciative that Mrs. Brandon had told him. The next day, Mr. Sample asked Mrs. Lynn about this. She again said there was no need to worry and that everything would be fine. So what do we have? A possible copyright violation for computer software. Section 2. Was anyone harmed in the copyright violation? While no one was physically harmed, there are legal and ethical issues that arise. Legally, a school cannot copy a computer software program to use multiple times unless it has a license that allows that. Also, the school had a breach of contract with the software company when Mrs. Lynn copied the program and handed it out to others. Now, schools are permitted to copy a program to keep as backup, but not to hand out and use it multiple times. So the ethical issues arise when Mrs. Lynn knows about the copyright laws and continues to copy. She mentioned that it wasn't likely for anyone to find out about it because they were such a small school and no one would care about a few copies. So let's actually narrow down what happened. We have a staff member from the St. Regis School making multiple copies of the computer software programs, violating copyright laws. So here's what you really need to know. So the people. We have Mr. Sample. He's in his 3rd year as principal at St. Regis. He is not originally from the area, so he has worked very hard to earn the support and the trust from the community members. We have Mrs. Lynn. She's a veteran library media specialist and a newly appointed computer lab teacher as the PTA just furnished a computer lab. We have Mrs. Brandon, who is a first-year teacher at St. Regis but has prior teaching experience at another school. The PTA members are also involved because they bought the software program and one of them came in to help Mrs. Lynn in the library and copied some of the materials. And then other staff are involved as they receive the copied materials. So this takes place at St. Regis. It's a K-8 school, and it's small rural town, 25 miles outside of any city. Now the computer software program is what we're looking at. And this program was to be installed only on the 20 computers inside the lab. Section 5. Am I informed enough to make a decision? Well, first, it's important to look at the stakeholders and who would be impacted by the decision. So I have the St. Regis staff, including the administration and the Board of Education. I have PTA members, and the software owners, and I would argue that students are also stakeholders, as they would be impacted by the decision. So knowing the stakeholders, have all of them been consulted? Unfortunately, no. Only the staff at St. Regis is aware of the situation, and that's really only because Mrs. Brandon told Mr. Sample about it. Now, it does not say anywhere in the readings that the PTA is aware of it or the administration or the board is aware of it. So, could the situation be damaging to stakeholders or to the community? Absolutely. A large amount of the funding comes from the PTA. So, if this becomes a legal case, that money may be needed to be used to pay the fees. This could cause the community to lose trust in the school and to lose trust in Mr. Sample, who has worked so hard for it. So would more information be helpful to make a decision? Yes, I think it would be. While I know quite a bit about the case, I would like to see what the user licensing agreement stated. Now, making a decision here, I really like how Mr. Sample had Mrs. Lynn stop making copies of the program and collected all of the copied materials and got rid of them. So section 6, let's talk about our options. First, I think we have about 3 possible options. Kind of look at it as the good, the bad, and the ugly. Option 1 would be taking no further action. Mr. Sample would stand by his original plan. He would stop all the copying, and all the copies would be collected and gotten rid of, and the situation is over. Forgotten. Option 2 would kind of be the middle ground, where we reprimand appropriate teachers. In this option, Mr. Sample would inform the school board and the PTA of the wrongdoing that went on, but assure them that he has taken care of the situation by putting a stop to the copying and collecting and deleting all the copied materials. There could be several different avenues in this option for the Board of Education and the administration to take. Mrs. Lynn could be disciplined and need to take additional professional development on copyright laws. She also could be reassigned to a different position where she is not in charge of the computer lab or media. Now, Mr. Sample would be required to have several copyright professional development days throughout the year to make sure that everyone understands the copyright laws, they're up to date with copyright laws, and they know the consequences. There would also have to be a new copyright policy put in place for St. Regis, and it would have to outline specific guidelines and harsh consequences of a copyright infringement. Now, option 3 would be the ugly for the school. This would be the legal action, and Mr. Sample and the Board of Education felt that they needed to self-report it to the software company. The legal actions taken in this would most likely cause St. Regis to have to delete every software program that they have from that company and then pay the fines. So Mrs. Lynn would be fired, and the teachers who willingly took the copied programs would be disciplined. Any of the PTA members that helped would also be removed from the association. So, after hearing our options, let's weigh them out. Option number 1. The pros to this would be that no one loses their job. Mrs. Lynn is still able to work at her school in her position. Mr. Sample doesn't create any conflict. The copies of the software are collected and no legal actions or disciplinary measures are taken, and the situation is handled simply. Now, the cons to this case would be the lack of trust Mrs. Brandon has in her new school. And while handling a situation like this doesn't necessarily encourage illegal actions, it doesn't totally discourage them either. So option 2, this situation is handled without a lawsuit, so that's a plus. Another good thing about this option is that teachers are disciplined for their actions without being fired. Because of the professional development opportunities throughout the school year, all staff will be up to date and understand copyright laws, and a new policy will be put into place. On the other side, the cons to this option would be that the copied software is gone and teachers cannot use it in their classroom to supplement. Teachers are also disciplined and could be reassigned, which would not be pleasurable. Finally, the PTA might be upset with this decision because the school is not stretching every dollar. So option 3. The pros to option 3 would be the sense of support that Mrs. Brandon feels in her new school when Mr. Sample takes action on the incident. Another pro would be that a complete lawsuit is avoided because the school self-reported the incident. Now, the cons in this option would be the support that is lost for Mr. Sample from community members and the PTA. He's worked so hard to gain all of this, so that would be hard to swallow. This in turn could create unfriendly working environments and relationships. I think another con in this would be how Mrs. Brandon feels remorseful for turning this situation into such a big deal. I don't think she ever meant to do that. She just wanted to do what was right. So, and finally, the last con that I have would be that St. Regis is looking for a new library media specialist and computer lab teacher. In a small community, that's a big deal. So, what's the best option? In my opinion, option 2 would be best. All of the stakeholders are aware of this situation, and a lawsuit is avoided. Mr. Sample puts a stop to the copying, and all of the copied material is collected and deleted. Professional development on copyright laws is established for the upcoming years, and so all teachers can understand copyright laws and are up to date. And also, new policies are created and put into place to protect the school and the employees. So finally, Section 9. What would it like to put this decision into action? If I were in Mr. Sample's position, I would first start by making sure all copies are stopped and the CDs are collected and deleted. Second, Mr. Sample would inform the Board of Education that what has happened and the steps that he has taken to deal with and plans to take to deal with it. I think the board will agree that professional learning opportunities are a must and a new policy needs to be written. I think the board would suggest reassigning Mrs. Lynn to a different position in the school. Next, it's important for Mr. Sample to have a conversation with all staff members. A very serious conversation will need to be had with Mrs. Lynn privately. The legal risks need to be addressed and discussed. A reassignment for Mrs. Lynn will be given, and she will be expected to complete additional professional learning. I feel that Mrs. Lynn will actually be thankful that they took this route once she knows the legal consequences that could have happened. So after that, Mr. Sample would need to set up professional development opportunities on copyright laws to keep all staff up to date. PTA members would also be invited to attend these learning opportunities as well, per the board's suggestion, in hopes that everyone will better understand copyright laws. Finally, Mr. Sample will contact the software company and inform them of the incident at St. Regis. Because Mr. Sample handled the situation and the copied programs were not used at all or for no longer than a day, the company will decide that a lawsuit is not needed. They will be firm with him, though, and address the copyright laws and consequences that could happen if it happens again. Lastly, Mr. Sample will offer to help with future fundraisers in hopes to gain that community support back that he worked so hard to get to begin with. At first, I think the community and the PTA members will be very upset with Mr. Sample as he begins this implementation plan, but as he moves throughout the implementation process, I think their attitude will change. I believe they will be thankful for his help in putting a stop to the situation and offering professional learning opportunities in hopes a situation like this doesn't happen again. Because on the other hand, it could have been a lot worse for them. I also think they will be grateful for his willingness to help in future fundraisers and provide input for what the school needs. So here is the reference that I used to help define the copyright law that was broken in this case. Thanks for listening. I hope you learned as much as I did.